Hi everyone, nice to see you again and thanks so much for coming back to watch. In this video we're going to look a bit more closely at the nature and the role of our behaviour and what our behaviour looks like individually for each of us and how it might be maintaining our distress. So what do we mean by compulsive behaviours? Compulsions and rituals are often repetitive and specific and usually take up a lot of our time and our energy. They can look on the surface very different for each of us, but the common theme between them is that they do temporarily make us feel a bit better. Longer term, they make our distress last a lot longer. Compulsions immediately after we carry them out usually make our thoughts feel a little less scary or a little less likely to come true. They also make us feel like we've done something about our thoughts. They also might turn down some of the really unpleasant physical symptoms that we experience. The problem is that by using compulsive behaviours to manage this, we learn to believe that it was these behaviours that kept us safe, or prevented thoughts that we've had from coming true. This means that we learn to rely on using them more and more to feel calm and to manage thoughts when they come up. We also probably find that rather than feeling more confident and capable in our abilities, we actually begin to doubt our abilities and our actions more, and find ourselves wanting to rely on compulsive behaviour even more to be certain that we did our best, or to be certain that we did something properly. Longer term, what we find happens is that by using these behaviours, our confidence begins to get ground down. The thoughts that we experience start to grow and get bigger and more powerful, and this takes up more and more time and energy as we battle them with our compulsive behaviour. So let's take a look at the common types of compulsive behaviours that we may recognise in ourselves. Checking. Checking is a really common compulsion and can often be driven by self-doubting thoughts. What if I didn't do it properly? I should probably do it again just in case. Checking is often a behaviour which can also become very repetitive in order to get that feeling of relief. An example of checking might be of locks or electrical appliances, or even of our own body for changes or symptoms of ill health. Decontaminating. So washing and cleaning rituals and behaviours often affect us if we worry about becoming unwell or being responsible for causing harm to others or causing others to become unwell. This is one that might be showing up for us more regularly just now with the increased need and advice around cleanliness and spreading of germs. Although this advice is obviously really important for us to follow, it may also have pushed an existing trigger button for us, meaning that it's likely we've taken this advice to the extreme, and our cleaning and washing rituals are likely to have become excessive, potentially repetitive, and knowing when to stop with these can be really hard. Ordering and magical rituals. Sometimes it's not just the action that makes it feel like we're doing something that's important, but it's also the way in which we do it that can feel vital. This often means that we develop particular orders or ways in which we carry out our compulsive rituals. And this quite often involves maybe a magical quality or a superstitious quality. For example, doing things in safe or unsafe numbers could be a good example of this, or having lucky or unlucky objects, words or even mantras. Neutralizing thoughts or rituals. These compulsive behaviours are harder to see. They might be invisible to people and they go on inside our minds. Often these are thoughts or rituals that we might deliberately engage in an effort to undo a thought that we've had, or to neutralise a thought that was seen as bad or dangerous to have. Hoarding. Hoarding objects is often the behaviour that people most commonly associate with OCD, but it can be driven by very different types of thoughts for people. It might be driven by a fear that we'll be left unprepared or even destitute if we don't keep certain belongings. Or a fear that someone may discover something about us if we were to get rid of certain objects. Hoarding can also provide a temporary feeling of certainty and comfort in an uncertain world. Each of these behaviours is something that we may use to get rid of unpleasant thoughts when they show up, but actually it's human nature to find ways to avoid feeling them in the first place. In this way, what we often learn to do behaviourally is to avoid things. This means that avoiding triggers that we know are likely to cause us to feel distress in the first place is sometimes an easier option than having to go through the exhausting process of using our compulsions and rituals to cope. Avoidance is a huge part in our behavioural patterns and can play a huge part in maintaining our distress. It might be helpful to think about what avoidance looks like for you before we go further. Compulsive behaviours and avoidance are really effective at preventing us from feeling distress, and certainly at getting rid of distress rapidly when it shows up. The problem is that they make our world increasingly smaller and limited, and we feel an increasing need to rely on them to cope. So you may be asking yourself, is my behaviour compulsive, or am I just taking sensible precautions? For the first time in our living history, we're being asked to avoid contact with our loved ones, to limit our travel, to stay at home if possible, to monitor our body closely for symptoms, and to remain hypervigilant to potential contamination. It's completely natural that these thoughts are going to be more prominent. And the reality is that our responses to these worries over recent months have likely protected us in many ways. But the chances are, if you're watching this video, then it's likely that these responses have also become excessive and probably far exceed the advice that we have been given. So how do we break the vicious cycle we might find ourselves stuck in? First, we need to identify the compulsive behaviours and forms of avoidance that we use to find relief. We also want to ask ourselves, what's the function of our behaviour? Are we following government advice and safety precautions, or are we responding to a frightening feeling or thought? What we do know is that usually we use our compulsions when our distress is at its worst, making us more likely to draw on them again whenever we feel this way. What we also know is that if we can approach the things that we may usually avoid and sit with these uncomfortable feelings without engaging in our compulsions, what our brain naturally starts to do is turn off the alarm that it's sounding. As time passes, we begin to feel calmer. By doing this, we also create an opportunity to test the thoughts that we have, even the scary ones, and to potentially learn that despite our brain giving us these thoughts, they did not become our reality. This means the next time we have this thought, it's a little easier to prevent ourselves from immediately responding to it using compulsive behaviours. Over time and practice of doing this gradually, yes, we probably still experience thoughts, but they start to lose a bit of their power, a bit like turning down the volume on a static radio. As thoughts become less scary, we become more confident in being able to respond to them differently, rather than only having one way of coping. This is a process called exposure and response prevention, or ERP. Exposure is the part where we deliberately approach things that we may have been avoiding, and response prevention is the part where we sit with our emotion and wait for it to subside without using our compulsive behaviours. So how do we use exposure and response prevention safely in a world where COVID-19 is a real threat? We need to be able to practice ERP safely and in line with government advice. This means that before we even start, we need some ground rules to follow, which will act as our template for what and how much we do. Remember, we're likely to feel a sense of anxiety, shame, or unease, and likely to experience a niggling thought that we should be doing more. First, we need to be clear about the specific government advice that exists and whether that's changed. There's so much information out there, it can be really hard to know exactly what we should and shouldn't be doing. For this reason, it's really important to clarify the advice first. The specific ground rules that we create for ourselves might be slightly different between each of us, but should all be based on the same key principle. Do what's recommended, but no more. Remember, we have the risk-averse brains that will likely want us to go the extra mile on this. And the more something matters to us, the more our brains will tell us to go that extra mile. This means that boundaries can often become very blurred, and we find ourselves responding excessively. For example, someone with obsessive thoughts in relation to contamination may want to create specific rules about how long they will spend washing their hands, and agree in advance that this will be no more than the recommended 20 seconds, for example. They may also create ground rules around the points in the day and the scenarios in which it's sensible and recommended to carry out hand washing, rather than basing their hand washing around the feeling that they need to. Having these ground rules helps us to respond safely, but also helps us to refrain from responding excessively, and to guide us as to when we can sit with a thought and ride the wave of emotion, rather than automatically responding to our distress with a compulsive behaviour. So before we begin planning our own ERP journeys, it's important to have a clear idea of the behaviours you want to tackle and a clear set of ground rules to help anchor you in moments of doubt and distress. It's natural to feel distressed during ERP, and in a sense, we need to experience this to allow ourselves the opportunity to test our thoughts and learn that our behaviour is not what has been averting disaster or keeping us safe for all this time. This distress doesn't last forever, and it gets less and less intense the further we progress through our ERP journey. Over time, we find that although we may still experience thoughts, they're not as distressing as they were at the beginning, and we can tolerate their presence without the need to use our compulsions to get rid of them. This process takes a bit of time, and it takes some repetition, but it is also really effective if we can stick with it. Before we start though, it's important to take time to prepare and plan how we're going to do this, and how we're going to tackle our own ERP journeys. If you'd like to find out a little more, watch the next video on planning and carrying out exposure and response prevention. Thanks for listening, and take good care.